The head of PlayStation Studios, Herman Hulst, has been doing the media rounds recently, and he spoke with at least 4 different sources about goings-ons within Sony's first-party initiative, at least vaguely. Let's start with this conversation with website Axios. There, Hulst confirms that Sony is going in on so-called games as a service. When we last heard from Sony, they had the first and second party number at 10, just for that style of monetization. To Axios, Hulst upped the number to 12. And as we already know that Horizon is coming to the games as a service space, it shouldn't be a surprise that he confirms that some of these dozen monetizable games will be existing franchises. Interestingly, he notes in part that, quote, some of our biggest titles in the single-player narrative-driven space are also our most profitable titles, end quote. This sounds impressive, but think about it. How couldn't that be the case? Sony doesn't have a single solitary example of a persistent, current, and popular multiplayer game, not one. If they weren't making money from their single-player games, they'd be in trouble. That said, they're continuing to look to diversify, with PC an obvious continued target, and mobile too, though their movement there is a little more obvious. I'm sorry, a little more mysterious, not obvious. As Axios notes, they recently bought mobile-first publisher and developer Savage, and that will no doubt hint at more to come. The juiciest thing to come out of Hulst's conversation with Newswire or Reuters, meanwhile, is probably something being overplayed. The possibility, vaguely hinted at, that maybe Sony would work with From Software, which it now owns a part of, on film and TV projects. He said in part, quote, you should think of collaborations on the game development side first and foremost, but it's also not unthinkable with our PlayStation Productions efforts that we explore opportunities, end quote. Meanwhile, a tidbit in his talk with publication GQ notes the following in part, describing Hulst's, quote, baptism by fire, end quote, after taking the reins of first party in 2019. Quote, the primary effect of the COVID-19 pandemic has been to slow walk what should have been PlayStation 5's launch lineup over a 2-year stretch. Only now, with next month's release of God of War Ragnarok, will that process be complete, end quote. He also reaffirms Sony's commitment to what is arguably better than anyone, and that's making story-driven games. Quote, PlayStation games are typically beautifully crafted worlds with great characters and have a really impactful, meaningful story. I think that's the DNA of what we have always created, and I don't want that to go away, end quote. He then reaffirms the 25 games in development line split between first and second party, of which half are new IP, and as noted earlier, 12 are live service games. Finally, Hulst repeats much of what we've already discussed here in his conversation with famous Japanese gaming publication Famitsu, though he does state what we suppose is obvious but is worth getting on the record. Quote, for mobile games, we basically want to release works based on existing IP, so you're making adjustments to the console title and releasing it on mobile. We are also considering crossplay between both console and mobile, end quote, noting Savage's game as an example of what it might do. So nothing new to coming to mobile, but potentially additive content. Also available on PS5. Dustin, a lot here. What do you think?
I don't know. For the audio listeners, I did the meme where you take off your headphones when you hear about crossplay with mobile. Just not liking that very much. But I think the thing that stands out to me the most here is, of course, the From Software bit is really interesting. In fact, it made me think of a meme in my head of like the meme where the guy's like, real shit, when he talks about working with From Software, and then for a TV show, I sleep. And that's exactly how I feel. Right. It's like the worst roller coaster ever of any kind of line that Herman Hulst has ever said. It reeks of someone who doesn't get it, of why people like From Software games. Yes, people do enjoy the lore and the stories of these games. You can see evidence of that in the numerous YouTubers who break down the lore. But they don't like, part of the reasons why they like it is its cryptic nature and how you discover it through playing a fucking video game. So I don't think that any fans of From Software really want a TV show or a movie based on these IP. I'm not saying it's impossible to make something good, but it just is a total lack of understanding of why people like those games. So I don't know. If it happens, maybe I would at least hope that they would take the animated route with it. But even that, I don't know, feels unlikely. But I don't know. There's a lot of things in this overall interview that there's nothing about it that's inherently bad, but a lot of it just feels like Sony pointed their ship in a direction that is not very appealing to the core gamers or whatever, listeners of this show, people like us. It doesn't feel good.
It feels like a very curated kind of, I guess that's the point of these things. They are curated. They are media trained. And I mean, like when we think about the games we make here at PlayStation, we've always made, games about big worlds and really meaningful stories. And I'm like, well, not always. Kind of recently, like in the last like 10 years, I think.
Yeah, I think it started probably in the PS3 era, really.
Yeah, like late PS3 is probably when that really started. I mean, I wouldn't really say Kratos pre God of War 2018 was a particularly like, deep and meaningful character. At least not the way he was written. But yeah, it feels that From Software TV show made me chuckle. Yeah. The idea of like you don't want a Dark Souls sitcom. You don't want Curb Your Enthusiasm in Yarnum. I don't know what you would even do with a show based on a game that is so cryptic and so unguided. Like it's very much a video game. Most of From Software's game, like it's very much not something that translates all that well. So I just, it is so weird.
Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Oh, I love it.
To me, well, this is why I don't think there's much here, because that's what I was saying in my write-up. I mean, from my perspective, I think people are kind of overplaying that. He says right out, he's like, our fundamental focus is games. And
right.
So I don't see much there. There are two things that he says that I think do stick out. The first is this throwaway about his quote, some of our biggest titles in the single player narrative driven space are also our most profitable titles, end quote. You only make those right now. So I would really hope that was true, Herman. I mean, I don't know what that was even supposed to be. Some people are even reporting that. And I'm like, well, can you name a single multiplayer game of any substance that has succeeded or really lived on PlayStation from first or second party? I mean, what game is that? So I thought that was just strange. I just feel like that was very media trained and very planted. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting was this idea that he talks, I think, to GQ about, where he says that God of War Ascension was... I'm sorry, not God of War Ascension. Why am I talking about God of War Ascension? God of War Ragnarok was really considered like a launch window game that really got unsettled, and that they're now just getting through all of that. And maybe that can explain or telegraph to us somehow the reason for the silence, that they really don't want to talk yet because they're not quite ready. But I still think they don't want to talk yet because I don't think we're going to like everything we see. I still think there's some major component to it of that. Not to say that the games aren't going to succeed, but that those like the PlayStationistas out here, they're not gonna like some of this stuff. I'm telling you, you're not.
You guys better really prep yourself. Okay, you're probably gonna hear a shocking amount of pop music, and you're gonna see a lot more dancing than you're used to. All right, I promise you. I promise you there's going to be obnoxious emotes and art styles are going to be very streamlined. You're going to see, man. I'm fully I wish I could place bets. Like I would bet a good 40% to maybe 50% of these games are going to look Fortnite adjacent. Not exactly the same, but they're going to be that streamlined kind of like simplified look so that they can run on mobile maybe.
Certainly one of them will. I mean, certainly at least one of them will have that aesthetic and that appeal. Sony has never succeeded in that space. Not that they've really tried very hard. I will give it to them. They never really tried. It's not. I think the hardest they really tried was with Kill Strain. And it's like,
I remember that.
It was a PS4 game from Sony San Diego. And it was like a MOBA style kind of weird thing.
Oh, yeah.
And that was like kind of the game I think they kind of most believed in internally, that to maybe do something, and Drawn to Death, I think, to a lesser extent, but they've never really tried. You have your Helldivers and all these random games, but those are not successful games. The Helldivers is going to get a sequel. So I don't know. It's interesting to hear him talk, but I just feel like what was the purpose of these interviews? These were obviously interviews pitched by Sony to a series of outlets. It's always interesting to see the outlets they work with. They have no respect for games media anymore. It's so funny. Like they don't care about the IGNs and the GameSpots at all. They don't talk to them. They talk to GQ. And
that is interesting.
Obviously a newswire like Reuters, and you speak to Famitsu, legendary publication. in Japan, especially to allay fears. That I read that interview in Famitsu, and it was all basically allaying fears that the Japanese industry was getting all fucked up by Sony and the removal of Japan Studio and all of that. So that's more what that's oriented about. But in the meantime, we'll continue to kind of keep our ear down. I don't know when they're going to say something. I think we're getting into the point where there's nothing more to say this year, right? I mean,
probably not.
Are they going to have an event this year? I mean, PlayStation Experience was in December back in the day. I just think things are different now. Well, let's do a gut check real quick. Dustin, do you think that we will have an event before the end of the year, or like some sort of, will we get another either, and you can be as illustrative as you want, but will we get either a state of play and or like some sort of showcase before the end of the year?
I think we will at the very least get a state of play before the end of the year. But I feel like people are hungry for a showcase and not a state of play at this point. The big thing, and this is a little bit into the next news topic, but they have to do some kind of stream for PSVR 2 at some point. So I think you can lock that in for this year. But as far as laying out their first party, I don't know. The way they've been so quiet, I would have expected it to happen by now. So I think that most likely we're going to get a PSVR 2 blowout. After that's released, maybe then we get a showcase. So that way they can kind of focus their marketing on the giant new product arm of PlayStation in early 2023.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You make a compelling case. Chris, where's your mind at?
I mean, that was pretty much exactly what I would have assumed as well. Like, I do think they have to start talking about PSVR sooner than later for sure. Especially just because it's we anticipate March, right? That's kind of our gut feeling. I know that's mine.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense to get it out at least maybe December or something. It'll be like an interesting December show. I don't think we're going to get like a proper game showcase like we got when the PS5 was first like really, really shown though. And I think that's in the cards for this year.